The call came at 8:30 on a Tuesday, without preamble or courtesy. Just my mother's voice, steady, clipped, saying, "Don't bother flying to Tarongo Bay. We've decided to dissolve Carter Estates." 10 words, 10 syllables, if you count the tiny pause before she hung up. I replayed it once, not because I doubted her, but because I braced myself for some wave of feeling, a jab of anger, a tightness in my chest, anything. But all I felt was quiet. My name is Rowan Carter. In that stillness, I heard what I'd always known. I was expendable. I am the younger child of 2. My father, Marcus Carter, built Carter Estates from bare land, first as a small orchard, then as a profitable cider press, and, finally, as a boutique retreat on New Zealand's Coromandel Peninsula. My older brother, Owen, was the heir apparent, bold, charismatic, and prone to risk in the way our father admired. Me? I stayed behind the scenes. I managed harvest schedules, negotiated equipment leases, and balanced the books. Invisibly efficient. Easily overlooked. I didn't return my mother's call that night. I didn't ask why. I didn't forward the voicemail to my father, who had always preferred business talk in closed-door meetings. Instead, I texted 2 words. Understood. Then, I opened my laptop, logged into the co-ownership portal I hadn't accessed since we finalised last year's expansion loan, and did what everyone assumed I would. I removed my name, not out of spite or rebellion, but out of clarity. 2 winters ago, when Carter Estates needed a $1.8 million loan to install a new solar irrigation system, the bank required a guarantor with sterling credit. My brother's score was teetering. My father's assets were tied up in real estate covenants. Mine were pristine, an Ivy League MBA and a near-perfect FICO. No one asked. The paperwork simply arrived. I signed. I believed loyalty meant belonging, but over time I realised even father's cherished motto, "We shape outsiders into insiders," was really about control. Marcus Carter built the orchard like he built our family, rule by rule, vine by vine, leaving no space for softness. The land came first, the family a distant second. Owen, with his easy smile and reckless ambition, was rewarded with glowing praise, invitations to exclusive tastings, and even a company-paid trip to London. By 20, I was reconciling supply chain disruptions in silence. By 22, I was coordinating seasonal hiring across 3 outposts while conspicuously absent from strategy meetings. No thanks, no recognition. Just the implicit expectation that I would disappear behind the spreadsheets. My mother, Elise, never struck me as cruel. She simply vanished into her role, organising client retreats in the mornings, collating invoices in the afternoons, and then, in the evenings, pulling me aside to whisper, "Your father's building something for us." Be grateful, love. Grateful I tried to be. I studied relentlessly, accepted a scholarship to Stanford for my MBA, and even turned down a corporate offer in Auckland because Marcus said, "Family first, career second." I believed him, and so I stayed to help secure a lease on a second orchard in Tarongo Bay. 6 months of negotiations, 6 banks analysed, an interest rate lock for 3 years, and again, when they needed a co-signer, they handed me the papers and an uncapped pen. I paused, a heartbeat, then I signed. Back then, I thought I was investing in a shared future. Now, alone in my small Wellington flat, the voicemail still faint in my ear, I recognised the real pattern. Each signature made me more useful and more invisible. If you're quiet long enough, you start to mistake invisibility for peace. But it isn't. It's silence, and silence breaks in laughter. My brother's laughter, to be exact. During last quarter's budget review, I raised a duplicated invoice for $14,600. Clear error. "Let it go," Owen said, flicking it away like chaff on his collar. He offers us premium apple varietals elsewhere. I looked to my father, hoping for a frown, a word of inquiry, but Marcus only sipped his coffee, eyes fixed on the vineyard view, and murmured, "Focus on bigger things, Rowan. Stop behaving like an outsider." That word sank beneath my skin and settled there. After that meeting, the changes began imperceptibly. The next morning, I went to log into our shared inventory system and found that my username had been deactivated. No notification, no temporary maintenance, just a locked screen demanding Owen's credentials. I emailed the IT manager with a polite request for reinstatement and received an automated reply about updating access rights. That afternoon, I tried to open the company credit card portal linked to my account and discovered the card had expired. Again, no explanation, just a terse note on the website. Account closed. Every time I asked for clarification, I got the same canned response. "We're in the middle of restructuring. Please hold off." Meanwhile, Owen effortlessly booked a flight to Melbourne for a cider trade conference under the company's expense code, complete with premium seating and a 4-star hotel. The disparity was impossible to ignore. I remember the exact moment I realised something fundamental had shifted. I was seated at my usual corner desk in the Wellington office, reviewing quarterly yield projections. A voicemail notification flashed on my phone. "Hey, sis, just FYI, Dad asked me to pick up your slack at the orchard after your access issues. Big news coming, Owen out." It wasn't sent. It was saved. A draft message that he never bothered to send me. That injustice lodged in my mind like an arrow. He was so confident that I would never see it. As I packed up my laptop that evening, I felt a quiet tightness. It was neither anger nor despair, but the ignition of something that felt more potent. Resolve. I knew I had to reclaim control over my own story. After all, I had done the hard work, nurturing saplings through droughts, negotiating vendor contracts during shipping crises, and keeping the books balanced when a freak frost wiped out half a season's crop. Yet, whenever I raised concerns beyond the ledger, questions about unaccounted expenses or shifts in production strategy, I was dismissed as too detail-oriented, or worse, as an outsider meddling in family matters. That night, I dusted off my laptop at home, opened a secure folder named Harbour Light, and began gathering every document I could access. Archived bank statements, vendor quotes, email threads, and copies of signed loan agreements. I photographed the faded signature blocks and cross-checked them with the master files I had downloaded years ago. I retrieved the hidden backup of our irrigation lease, which bore my name in multiple places. Then, I reached out to my old classmate from Stanford Law, Lena Hoffman. We hadn't spoken since graduation, but I knew she specialized in corporate governance and dispute resolution. Over coffee the next afternoon, Lena and I sat at a quiet cafe near Courtenay Place. I offered her a concise summary: unauthorized access revocations, unexplained credit card cancellations, and a hidden liability on the expansion loan. She flipped through the documents, browsed the email archives I'd forwarded, and tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Rowan," she said, "the bank cannot legally hold you to a loan if you're not officially a guarantor. And if your access was revoked unilaterally, that's a governance breach within Carter Estates. You have every right to demand your removal, and you can challenge any claims against you. But the key is timing. You need to act before they restructure the board and silence you completely." Her words crystallized my plan. I would prepare a formal withdrawal letter, outline the governance violations, and serve notice to both the bank and the board. I would seal my exit officially, and then let the dominoes fall. It felt like stepping onto a cathedral's rooftop. Exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Back in my Wellington flat, I drafted the letter, quoting the exact clauses from our shareholder agreement and corporate bylaws. I referenced Section 12, subsection 4, which stipulated that any co-owner could withdraw with 30 days written notice, provided they were not a named guarantor. I attached a spreadsheet of irregular payments, over $20,000 funneled through a shell company owned by one of Owen's friends, labelled marketing research, but with no campaign to show. I highlighted duplicate maintenance invoices, inconsistent harvest yield reports, and vendor payments exceeding budgeted allowances. I organised everything meticulously and saved 2 versions, one to upload to the corporate portal, another to email directly to the bank's loan officer, James Whitaker, whom I had negotiated with during the solar project financing. The night before sending the notice, I barely slept. My mind raced with potential repercussions, lawsuits, defamation claims, family estrangement. Yet, beneath the apprehension, I felt a fierce clarity I'd never known. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it to assert my own agency, to reclaim my name from their control. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I logged into the Carter Estates portal with my administrative credentials still intact. The screen greeted me with a message: amendment options available. I clicked Withdraw Co-Ownership, uploaded my signed notice, and confirmed with my PIN. The confirmation was almost anticlimactic. Update received. Pending compliance review. Then I forwarded the same documents to James Whitaker at Meridian Bank, along with a cover letter detailing the irregularities I'd found. No apologies. No threats. Just facts. By lunch, Meridian had frozen the operating account tied to Carter Estates until they completed their internal audit. Orders were paused, vendor payments halted, and the board's credit lines suspended. And in the sudden silence of an empty inbox, I felt something lift. I opened a new document, titled it Project Harbour Light, and drafted a client proposal for my consulting services, helping small agritech ventures navigate growth without losing control. That evening, I left my phone on airplane mode and cooked a simple dinner, roasted sweet potato and kale salad. I poured a glass of Pinot Noir, sat on my balcony, and watched the city lights blink on one by one. For the first time in years, I was entirely free to choose my own horizon. That evening, my phone buzzed incessantly against the polished oak of my writing desk. 32 missed calls from my father, 17 from my mother, 9 from Owen, and 1 unfamiliar number. I stared at the list, the digits blurring into a blur of black and white. For years, I had associated incessant notifications with crisis: broken machinery in the orchard, a shipping container delayed at port, a critical payroll glitch. Now they rang hollow, like ghosts demanding my attention for sins I hadn't committed. I listened first to the voicemail from Meridian Bank's loan officer, James Whitaker. His voice was tight, anxious. "Ms. Carter, Rowan, this is James Whitaker. The account freeze was in response to irregular compliance flags, but we can unfreeze temporarily if you withdraw the notice. Please call me back immediately." His words echoed my own strategy back at me, a perversely accurate mirror. They wanted me to relent, to withdraw the withdrawal, to restore my complicity. I didn't call him back. Instead, I opened my secure folder, Project Harbour Light, and added his message to the Evidence subfolder, where each audio file, PDF, and screenshot rested like jagged teeth waiting for their day in court. Next, I braved my father's voicemail. His tone was controlled fury. "Rowan, how could you? I gave you everything, every resource, every opportunity. You better have a damn good reason for this." He didn't leave a callback number. He expected me to hear the accusation and capitulate, but I had rehearsed my response. I would not bow to an unseen power. My brother's text messages were shorter, but no less venomous. "What the hell did you think was going to happen? You're jeopardizing everyone's livelihood. Call me or don't. Your choice." I scanned them, then hit archive. I no longer craved a sword fight, I wanted a courtroom, or at least irrefutable documentation. Late that night, I set aside my phone, brewed chamomile tea, and sat on the narrow couch in my Wellington flat. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to my mother, Elise Carter. I wrote calmly, using bullet points. 1. I have formally withdrawn from Carter Estates co-ownership agreement effective today. 2. I have reported governance breaches and financial irregularities to Meridian Bank and am demanding a full audit. 3. I am available to discuss the transition process on neutral legal terms. I paused over the discuss line, then deleted it. I would not negotiate at her behest. My letter ended. Mother, this decision is irrevocable. I wish you and Owen well in resolving the estate's affairs. Please direct any future correspondence to my legal counsel, Lena Hoffman, at the contact below. I clicked send and felt a weight lift. It was almost midnight. The next morning, I awoke to silence. No pings, no voice notifications, only the distant hum of traffic outside my window. I stared at the ceiling, feeling for the first time in months that my body had permission to rest. I made strong coffee and walked to my home office, really the tiny alcove at the end of my living room, where a half-finished consulting proposal awaited my attention. As I reviewed the draft for a boutique agritech startup in Hawke's Bay, the doorbell rang. I crossed the small apartment, heart fluttering. A uniformed courier stood on my landing, holding a small white envelope with no return address. My name and street was scrawled in familiar handwriting. My own. I took it inside and carefully slit it open. Inside was a single sheet of embossed stationery. Carter Estates Tire Limited. Board of Directors. Notification of resignation beneath the letterhead, a paragraph. Ms. Rowan Carter. The board acknowledges receipt of your notice of withdrawal from co-ownership and governance activities, effective immediately. Your past contributions to Carter Estates are recognised. We regret your departure and wish you future success. It was signed by my father, and not just his printed name, but his actual signature in deep blue ink. Below that, a second signature, Owen's, shaky and uneven. I stared at the page, feeling a complex swirl. Vindication, relief, regret. They'd finally put ink to paper, legitimizing my departure. And yet, it wasn't gratitude. It was a perfunctory formality. I placed the letter on my desk and dialed Lena Hoffman. She answered on the first ring, her voice bright. So they acknowledged it? I exhaled. Yes. Official, board approved. No legal recourse if they try to reinstate me. She chuckled. Now we wait for Meridian to confirm the audit results. In the meantime, you're clear. I felt tears sting my eyes. Tears of complicated victory. I hadn't expected an emotional release. I'd focused on facts and clauses. But as I hung up, I realised something. I was grieving an identity I'd carried for years. The family business had shaped me, even as I shaped it. Letting go meant redefining who I was. I spent the rest of the morning crafting a blog post for my budding consulting practice, a curated narrative of independence, compliance, and ethical leadership. I framed it as a cautionary tale for emerging agritech founders, the perils of conflating family loyalty with business governance, the necessity of transparent accounting, and the power of asserting one's professional value. I attached a link to my LinkedIn profile and clicked Publish. That evening, with the sun low over the Wellington harbour, I took a long walk along Oriental Parade. The sky was a wash of pink and gold, and I paused to watch a ferry glide past. In that moment, I felt untethered. Neither Carter nor outsider, neither daughter nor co-owner, just me. Rowan Carter, consultant, author of my own story. My phone remained silent. No messages from my former colleagues, no imploring calls from family. I let it stay that way. I reached into my tote bag, pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, and jotted 3 words at the top of a fresh page. New beginnings start here. Then I closed the notebook, tucked it under my arm, and continued walking into a future I would chart on my own terms. In the days that followed their formal acknowledgement, life settled into a new, deliberate rhythm. I awoke each morning without the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that had become second nature during countless board meetings, budget reviews, and crisis calls. Instead, I found a quiet anticipation, an eagerness to fill my hours with work of my choosing, rather than reactive firefighting. I spent my first full workday drafting a detailed roadmap for Harbour Light Consulting, my newly christened advisory practice. The name felt apt. The harbour had always been a place of refuge and renewal in Wellington, and I intended my firm to serve the same purpose for emerging agritech ventures. I outlined 3 core service offerings: compliance audits, financial governance workshops, and strategic exit planning. I crafted each section with precision, drawing on my personal experience of contractual clauses, lender negotiations, and board dynamics. As I composed the prose, I recalled the moment I first discovered the duplicate invoice of $14,600, a shock that had set the entire unravelling into motion. I imagined how that anecdote could resonate with a family-owned farm struggling to reconcile passion with profitability. I drafted sample case studies, how a small-scale microbrewery could avoid the pitfalls of undisclosed loans, how a sustainable fisheries cooperative might fortify its bylaws against unilateral board decisions, and how a boutique vineyard could formalise exit clauses to protect third-generation stewards. By midday, I had assembled a sleek 7-page proposal, complete with bullet point testimonials from my former Stanford classmates, 3 of whom had already agreed to endorse my credentials, and a polished fee schedule in New Zealand dollars. All numbers were spelled out in words: 1,200, 3,500, 18 months of advisory, 5% success bonus. I attached it to an email addressed to Aurora Moon, founder of Pacific Aquaponics, a woman-led startup in Hawke's Bay that had recently appeared in the industry press. When I hit send, a rush of exhilaration coursed through me. For years, I had fine-tuned other people's spreadsheets and board decks. Now, I was launching my own vessel. That afternoon, I received a call from Sabrina Kim, my personal accountant and confidant. Her voice was warm with excitement. "Rowan, I just filed your business registration. Harbour Light is official. The tax number is NZBN0985743221, and your first intake of clients can begin immediately." She read out the registration details patiently, and I repeated each aloud, savouring the sound of my own name printed on legal documents not tethered to Carter Estates. "Thank you, Sabrina," I said softly. I appreciate everything." She laughed. "This is only the beginning. Now, get out there and shine that harbour light." Hanging up, I realised how much I had craved encouragement, simple validation that my work mattered. My father's praise had always hinged on conformity, my brother's on bravado. Sabrina's, by contrast, was rooted in partnership. Energised, I spent the rest of the afternoon updating my LinkedIn profile, replacing my title of Operations Director, Carter Estates with founder and principal consultant, Harbour Light Consulting, adding new skills in corporate governance, agritech, sustainability, and exit strategy development, and uploading a professional headshot taken last summer on the wharf, sunlight streaking across my wind-tousled hair. By early evening, I had 8 connection requests and 3 inbound messages. One was from Ethan McAllister, co-founder of Greenwave Hydroponics, seeking a 30-minute introductory call. Another from Mei Chen, CFO of Southern Orchard Ventures, inquiring about a full-day workshop on board best practices. And a third from Patrick Reynolds, the Deputy Mayor of Wellington City, offering to feature me in a local business conference next month. My heart fluttered. Invitations like these had once been channeled through corporate secretaries or filtered by assistant managers. Now they came directly to me. That night, I closed my laptop and poured a cup of green tea. I sat on the balcony of my flat, overlooking the harbour lights, The city felt both familiar and transformed, like me. The soft hum of ferries, the distant laughter of late-night strollers, the gentle lapping of water against the wharf, all of it spoke of possibility. I reflected on the letter from Carter Estates, my father's and my brother's signatures in deep blue ink, acknowledging my departure. It had arrived in a plain white envelope, but among its sterile formality lay a profound truth. I had reclaimed my name. No longer a guarantor hidden in footnotes. No longer an outsider silenced by family dynamics. Tomorrow, I would prepare for my first client call with Pacific Aquaponics. I would review their financials, familiarize myself with their fish-to-plant ratios, and draft preliminary recommendations on tightening their governance charter. But for tonight, I allowed myself to feel the simple satisfaction of agency. I closed my eyes and whispered, almost to the harbour breeze, "You're finally visible." Then, I sipped my tea, tasting the tang of lemongrass and mint, and let the city cradle me in its luminous calm. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my own alarm. No frantic phone calls, no urgent emails demanding explanations. Instead, there was only a soft chime from my calendar, reminding me of my first official call with Pacific Aquaponics at 8:30. I slid out of bed and padded across the wooden floorboards of my Wellington flat, my heart brimming with anticipation rather than dread. Over a mug of freshly brewed black tea, I reviewed the proposal I'd sent to Aurora Moon. I had outlined a comprehensive compliance audit, highlighting 4 key areas: contractual clarity, financial oversight, board governance, and risk management. I'd suggested an initial 2-day on-site visit to Hawke's Bay to conduct interviews and system walkthroughs, followed by a 3-week remote analysis and a final presentation of recommendations. All of it was spelled out in precise, confident language. Language I knew by heart because I had lived it. At 8:10, I logged into the video conference platform. My screen lit up with Aurora's warm smile framed by the lush green of her indoor fish tanks. She introduced me to her operations manager, Gabe Sinclair, and their head aquaculturist, Priya Patel. Within minutes, the meeting felt more like a collegial brainstorming session than a formal consultation. "I've read your proposal, Rowan," Aurora began, her New Zealand accent soft and clear. "Your experience with Carter Estates intrigues me. I want to understand how you'd approach our decentralized funding model, where local growers and fish farmers each invest in separate pods. We've hit governance snags where no one person has ultimate oversight." I nodded. Decentralized models are powerful for community engagement, but can fragment accountability. In my audit, I'll map out decision-making flows and identify any overlap or gaps. For example, if you have 10 pod investors, each holding 10% equity, you need a charter that defines voting thresholds, say a 75% majority for budget approvals, so decisions aren't held hostage by a single dissenting minority. Priya leaned forward. "That makes sense. We've struggled with pod owners refusing to fund critical system upgrades, even when those upgrades benefit the entire facility." "Exactly," I replied. "My first recommendation is to establish a pod council with rotating leadership. Each quarter, one owner chairs the council, ensuring everyone's interests are represented. Then, implement clear escalation protocols. If a pod council cannot reach the required majority for essential maintenance, those decisions escalate to an executive committee you and Gabe would chair." Gabe scribbled notes eagerly. Aurora's eyes shone with relief. "That's practical. I can already see how it reduces bottlenecks." We spent the next 45 minutes drilling deeper into Pacific Aquaponics' budgeting cadence, vendor contracting process, and potential governance blind spots. I walked them through a mock flowchart, showing how an annual budget proposal would move from pod investors to the council to the executive committee, then to the bank for funding release. By the end of the call, Aurora was smiling broadly. "This is exactly why I reached out. Rowan, I'd like to formally engage you for a full compliance audit and governance workshop. Can we start next Monday?" I took a steadying breath before responding. "Absolutely." I'll send over an engagement letter by end of day with the refined scope. After the call, I leaned back in my chair, marvelling at how seamlessly the session had gone. For years, I had held back in meetings with my family, deferring to Owen's charisma and my father's authority. Now, I was leading the conversation, and clients were welcoming my expertise. That afternoon, I crafted the engagement letter, ensuring every deliverable, timeline, and fee detail was spelled out. I included a clause offering no risk cancellation within 14 days if Pacific Aquaponics wasn't satisfied, an extra layer of confidence that echoed my own commitment to transparency. I also attached a one-page outline for the governance workshop, complete with interactive exercises and case studies drawn from my own experiences at Carter Estates. By sunset, the signed engagement letter sat in my inbox. Aurora had added a personal note. "Welcome aboard, Rowan. Excited to have you guide us?" I printed the letter and placed it on my desk under a small brass paperweight, engraved with an anchor, a gift from Sabrina on the day I registered Harbour Light. It felt emblematic of my new stance, grounded, steadfast, and unafraid of the tides. That evening, I took a leisurely walk to the waterfront, the golden light of dusk shimmering on the harbour waves. I reflected on the journey from Carter Estates' back rooms, where my ideas were dismissed, to this moment of undeniable momentum. My phone remained silent, but I no longer equated silence with exclusion. Instead, it was the calm before the busy days ahead. I paused at a bench overlooking the water, opened my notebook, and wrote a new entry titled Milestones. Under it, I listed first client call completed, engagement letter signed, governance workshop outline drafted. Beneath those, I added a final line in bold, claimed my expertise, defined my value. I closed the notebook and looked up at the harbour lights twinkling like distant constellations. In that soft glow, I felt a deep sense of purpose. I was no longer the invisible hand behind someone else's legacy. I was the visible architect of my own. And as long as I kept my name in ink and in law, no one could make me disappear again. The weekend arrived, and with it, the first real respite I'd experienced in years. No client calls, no inbox notifications demanding immediate action, just the promise of 2 days where my only responsibility was to myself. I decided to spend Saturday exploring the nearby Remitaka Forest Park, trading business plans for bird calls and the scent of manuka blossoms. I packed a small backpack with water, a light snack, and my leather-bound notebook, then caught the early train from Wellington Station. As the carriage rumbled north, I watched mist rise from the hills, pale tendrils dissolving into the morning light. I realised I hadn't ridden a train without my mind racing about spreadsheets or corporate bylaws since my undergraduate years. The unfamiliar freedom felt exhilarating and, at times, unsettling, like stepping off a tightrope onto solid ground. When the train pulled into Upper Hutt, I disembarked and followed a sign toward the Kaitoki Regional Park entrance, where marked trails led into ancient beech forest and alongside tumbling streams. Within minutes, I traded the hum of engines for the quiet symphony of nature, cicadas chirring in the canopy, tuis flitting between branches, and the steady rush of the Pakuratahi River far below. I hiked the Golan Track for roughly 6 kilometres, pausing at scenic overlooks to jot reflections in my notebook. I wrote about the stark contrast between my former life, marked by closed-door board meetings and whispered directives, and this unguarded expanse where decisions were mine alone. I considered how I had chained myself to a legacy that never saw me, and how I now relished being both author and protagonist of my own story. By midday, I reached the junction overlooking the river bend. I sat on a mossy rock, ate a homemade spinach and feta wrap, and allowed the sunlight through the ferns to warm my skin. I felt remarkably at peace. And yet, as the wind whispered through the canopy, a subtle restlessness stirred. I realised that, even free from Carter Estates, I craved structure and purpose. I thrived not only on autonomy, but on engagement, on solving problems, guiding teams, and witnessing transformation. The challenge, I concluded, was to balance independence with meaningful collaboration. With that clarity, I returned to Wellington just as the sky shifted from gold to lilac. In the evening glow, the city looked different, softer, less imposing. I walked to my favourite sushi bar near Cuba Street, ordered a vegetable roll and miso soup, and sat at the counter where the chef greeted me by name. The familiar warmth of local acknowledgement grounded me. I realised that building a professional identity outside of my family's shadow required not only legal separation, but also community integration. My network of mentors and peers, Sabrina, Lena, and the Stanford Group, would serve as my new board of advisors. On Sunday morning, I awakened early and brewed strong coffee. I spent the first hour writing a blog post titled Finding Purpose Beyond Legacy, recounting my hike and the insights gleaned amid bird calls and river spray. I wove in lessons about nature's resilience and parallels to enterprise, how forests regenerate after fires, how rivers carve new paths when blocked, and how ecosystems thrive on diversity and balance. I concluded the post with an invitation to readers to share their own experiences of stepping beyond expectations and forging fresh trajectories. By lunchtime, the post had received dozens of views and comments, entrepreneurs and professionals sharing their personal forest metaphors and words of encouragement. I replied thoughtfully to each comment, fostering genuine connection rather than treating feedback as a checkbox. In these exchanges, I felt the first genuine sense of professional camaraderie I'd missed in years under Carter Estate's insular hierarchy. That afternoon, I organised my workspace for the week ahead. I cleared old files from my filing cabinet, documents tied to the orchard expansion, notes from Carter Estate's board meetings, obsolete vendor quotes, and placed them into a storage box labelled Archive 2023. I filed my new consulting files under Harbour Light 2025 in crisp, colour-coded folders. The process felt ritualistic, like releasing one version of myself to make way for another. As dusk settled, I prepared a simple dinner of roasted kumara and grilled halloumi, pouring a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. My choice, not simply what was stocked in the Carter Estate's cellar. I dined on my balcony, listening to the distant horns of ferries and watching the harbour lights emerge. I read through the engagement letter for Southern Orchard Ventures, mentally rehearsing the governance workshop I would lead next Tuesday. Then, I reviewed the itinerary for Pacific Aquaponics farm visit the following week, ensuring my travel plans were confirmed and my presentation deck finalised. Before bed, I returned to my leather-bound notebook and penned a new entry under Batch 6 Groundwork. Nature Retreat, Regained Perspective, Published Reflection, Community Engagement, Workspace Reset, Archived Old, Organised New, Prepared. For upcoming projects, Southern Orchard and Pacific Aquaponics. I closed the notebook and inhaled deeply, feeling the fine line between release and renewal. I had stepped away from a legacy that never truly embraced me, only to step into a purpose I had chosen and crafted myself. In that knowledge lay my power. And, as I switched off the lamp, the final thought that drifted through my mind was a firm reassurance. I belonged to my own vision, to a community of peers, and to the promise of each new dawn. Monday morning arrived brisk and clear, the air scented with salt from Wellington Harbour. I dressed deliberately in a tailored navy blazer, crisp white blouse, and charcoal slacks. Professional yet approachable attire, chosen to reflect the balance of authority and collaboration I intended to bring to Southern Orchard Ventures governance. Workshop. As I gathered my notes and laptop into the leather briefcase that once carried my Carter Estate's credentials, I felt a surge of purpose. This was no longer about family expectations or legacy obligations. This was entirely mine. I arrived at Southern Orchard's headquarters, a restored barn on the outskirts of Nelson, at 9 o'clock sharp. The building's weathered timbers blended seamlessly with the surrounding apple groves, and the morning sun filtered through mullioned windows, casting warm patterns on the polished wooden floor. I paused on the threshold, inhaling the crisp scent of fresh timber and orchard earth, and reminded myself to savour every detail of this day, the first independent workshop under the Harbour Light banner. Inside, I was greeted by Mei Chen, the company's chief financial officer, whose bright smile and firm handshake radiated genuine enthusiasm. She introduced me to the boardroom, a long, repurposed harvest table surrounded by an eclectic mix of high-back chairs, each one donated by a long-time vendor. On the wall hung a whiteboard stitched together from reclaimed pallets, already adorned with colourful sticky notes marking goals, pain points, and risk areas. The scene was a testament to the company's commitment to sustainability and creative problem-solving, principles I valued deeply. By 9:15, Tamsin Rivers, the operations manager, and Jai Patel, the head of marketing, had joined us. Tamsin nodded as I began setting up my laptop. We've been looking forward to your perspectives on formalizing our decision-making processes. We trust your experience will help streamline our board meetings and clarify responsibilities. Jai offered me a cup of herbal tea, peppermint with a hint of manuka honey, an unmistakable taste of Aotearoa. I accepted gratefully, placing the steaming mug beside my laptop. I launched the workshop with a brief personal introduction. How I had co-managed a multi-million-dollar expansion loan at Carter Estates, only to realise that governance without inclusion breeds invisible liabilities. I shared a sanitized version of the $14,600 duplicate invoice story, emphasizing how early detection and transparent escalation protocols can avert serious financial missteps. The room was attentive. Their nods and occasional note-taking signaled that they resonated with my experiences. Next, I guided them through a 5-step governance framework. 1. Define roles and responsibilities. Clear delineation of each board member's legal and operational duties. 2. Establish decision thresholds, specifying voting majorities required for budget approvals, strategic pivots, and emergency measures, whether simple majority, 2/3, or 75%. 3. Implement escalation protocols, outlining pathways for unresolved disputes to advance from project leads to executive committees or external arbitration. 4. Document and communicate, ensuring every decision, vote, and action item is recorded in an accessible digital repository with standardized meeting minutes and follow-up assignments. 5. Review and adapt, scheduling annual governance audits to refine the framework in response to growth, personnel changes, or market shifts. I elaborated on each step with concrete examples, inviting Tamsin and Jai to relate them to Southern Orchard's seasonal cycles, how harvesting schedules overlap with financial audits, how marketing rollouts depend on synchronized board approvals, and how rapid responses to weather disruptions require pre-approved emergency funds. When Jai mentioned an instance where a promotional campaign launch was delayed due to an absent quorum, I recommended incorporating a 48-hour emergency meeting provision, either in person or via secure video link, a guideline they immediately praised. At midday, we broke for lunch, a communal spread of locally sourced cheeses, crusty sourdough, and a vibrant salad tossed with orchard fruits. As we ate, we discussed real-world scenarios. How to handle a pod investor who withheld funding for a critical cold storage upgrade, how to mediate conflicts between older and newer shareholders, and how to integrate succession planning for third-generation family members. These conversations flowed naturally from the framework I'd introduced, indicating that my material was not just theoretical, but deeply applicable. After lunch, I facilitated an interactive exercise. Participants were divided into 2 teams and given a mock crisis scenario involving a sudden hopper failure in the juicing facility during peak harvest. Each team drafted a decision tree outlining the flow of approvals, from operations to finance to board sign-off, and then presented their solutions. The friendly competition sparked laughter, and underscored the importance of pre-established channels. When both teams converged on a similar escalation protocol, routing urgent approvals to a 2-member emergency committee, I knew we had hit upon a sustainable practice they could immediately adopt. By 3:30, we reconvened for final reflections. I invited feedback and addressed lingering questions about digital record-keeping tools and external audit schedules. Tamsin summed up the group's sentiments. "Rowan, your insights have already given us clarity. Tomorrow, we'll draft our own governance charter based on today's framework and aim to finalise it by next week." Her words filled me with quiet pride. This was tangible impact, far removed from the silent burdens I'd once shouldered under Carter Estate's roof. As the workshop concluded at 4:30, I gathered my notes and slipped them into a folder labelled Governance Workshop Summary, complete with action items and recommended timelines. I toured the facility with Jai, who showed me the cold rooms and the new storage annex, emphasising the very areas we'd addressed in the morning. Before departing, I paused at the orchard's edge, inhaled the crisp autumn air, and whispered a silent thank you to the forces that had led me here. Driving back to Wellington that evening, the road winding through golden hillsides, I reflected on how far I'd come. No longer the invisible co-signer whose name was buried in back-office portals. I was an acknowledged expert, guiding ambitious enterprises toward resilient futures. My phone, though still silent from familial fallout, remained a trusted conduit for client communications, and as the horizon stretched before me, I knew that every mile brought me closer to forging my own legacy, one built on transparency, inclusion, and the steadfast light I now carried within. I woke at dawn to the soft hum of my apartment's heat pump and the gentle glow of streetlights filtering through my curtains. Today was the on-site visit to Pacific Aquaponics, my first multi-day engagement that would test both my logistical planning and my ability to translate remote recommendations into real-world practice. I dressed in tailored khaki trousers and a lightweight linen blouse, tucking a slim notebook into the pocket of my satchel, along with my tablet, a spare charger, and my well-worn leather portfolio. All numbers, dates, and action items were spelled out in words in my onboarding document. 2-day site assessment, 3-week remote analysis, 75% decision threshold recommendations. I was ready. By 7 o'clock, I had grabbed a strong espresso at the nearby cafe and hailed a rideshare to Wellington Airport. The crisp morning air invigorated me as the car wove through empty streets. I reviewed my notes on Pacific Aquaponics' decentralized funding structure, picturing the pods of fish tanks and hydroponic beds that Aurora had described. I had drafted a preliminary flowchart for decision-making protocols and flagged key questions about investor communication pathways. Confidence mingled with anticipation. This was the culmination of months of planning and the first opportunity to see my strategies in action. The flight to Napier was smooth, and as the plane descended over Hawke's Bay, the patchwork of vineyards and orchards gave way to clusters of sleek greenhouses and aquaponic facilities. From the window, I could just make out Pacific Aquaponics' main site, a complex of interconnected glass domes glinting in the morning sun. I checked my watch, 9:35, and texted Aurora, "I'm on site. Meet me by the main entrance gate in 10 minutes?" Her swift reply, "See you there, Rowan," set a smile on my face. At 10 on the dot, Aurora, wearing rubber-soled boots and company-branded coveralls, greeted me with a firm handshake. She introduced me to the site manager, Miguel Santos, whose quiet professionalism soon eased us into conversation. As we walked through the initial greenhouse, rows of tilapia glided beneath nutrient-rich water, while vibrant kale and basil sprouted from floating rafts. Miguel explained the morning's system checks: water, pH levels, temperature regulation, and pump inspections. I observed carefully, taking notes on environmental controls and noting opportunities to integrate automated alerts into their dashboard. Alerts that would trigger notifications if pH drifted more than 0.2 units from the optimal 6.8 threshold. We moved next to the investor pavilion, where a circular table stood surrounded by ergonomic chairs. Color-coded charts on a whiteboard indicated each pod's equity share and investment timeline. I asked Aurora and Miguel to walk me through a recent budgeting impasse that had stalled the purchase of a backup generator. Aurora explained that one investor had withheld funds pending approval from the council, and the delay had threatened to shut down pumps during peak heat. It was exactly the kind of scenario I had addressed in our remote sessions. I pointed to the flowchart I'd sketched on my tablet. Here, you can see the escalation protocol at work. When a pod council fails to reach a 75% majority within 48 hours, the matter escalates to the executive committee, yourself and Gabe. In practice, you can convene via secure video link and approve emergency purchases up to a predefined spending cap, say 5,000 New Zealand dollars, without waiting for full council consensus. Aurora nodded thoughtfully, envisioning how to update their governance charter accordingly. For the next 2 hours, we cycled through functional areas: finance, operations, and community relations. I conducted interviews with 2 pod investors via video call, observing how their communication preferences varied, from email to text to phone calls, and recommending a centralized digital portal where they could track agenda items, cast votes, and upload supporting documents. I demonstrated a prototype interface on my tablet, showing how alerts and reminders would pop up based on decision deadlines. By midday, we convened under the investor pavilion for a working lunch: locally baked bread, artisanal cheeses, and freshly pressed apple juice. Over the meal, I facilitated a mini workshop. I asked each participant to share one governance challenge they faced. Then, we collectively mapped solutions using the framework from the workshop at Southern Orchard. The exchange was energizing. One investor, Kiri T. Ware, suggested incorporating a monthly summary newsletter summarizing key decisions and next steps. I encouraged them to formalize this in their communication protocol, ensuring transparency and accountability. After lunch, I led a hands-on training session on digital record keeping. I walked Miguel through setting up a secure folder structure on their cloud platform. First-level directories for board minutes, financial reports, and audit logs. Second-level subfolders by date. And a clear naming convention. For example, Year 2025, month March day, 15 Investor Council minutes. We practiced uploading sample meeting minutes and tagging action items with due dates. By the end of the session, Miguel was confidently navigating the interface and assigning tasks to colleagues. At 4 p.m, we gathered for closing reflections in the investor pavilion. Aurora expressed her gratitude. "Rowan, you've given us a roadmap that's practical and tailored. We leave today with clear next steps and the tools to implement them." I reviewed our agreed-upon action items, updating the bylaws to include emergency escalation provisions, launching the investor portal by month-end, and scheduling a quarterly governance audit starting in 6 weeks. I promised to follow up with a detailed report and draft revisions to their governance charter within 10 business days. Later, as I packed my portfolio, Aurora walked me to her electric vehicle. She handed me a small token, a handcrafted wooden token engraved with the company's logo. "For your harbour light," she said with a warm smile. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling its smooth weight against my hand. On the drive back to Napier Airport, I reflected on the day's flow: observation, dialogue, demonstration, and co-creation. It had been more than just ticking boxes. It had been about building trust and empowering the team. My phone buzzed with a message from Aurora. "Already hearing positive feedback from investors. You've transformed how we govern." I allowed myself a moment of pride and satisfaction. The flight back to Wellington carried me home as daylight faded into dusk. Wellington's lights welcomed me back as the plane descended. By 9 that night, I was in my flat, reviewing my notes and drafting the on-site assessment report. The room felt quiet yet alive with possibility. I poured a cup of chamomile tea and opened my leather-bound notebook to a fresh page titled Pacific Aquaponics Day 1 Insights, beginning my reflections. Effective emergency escalation protocol defined. investor communication portal designed, digital record-keeping tools implemented and tested, governance charter draft to be delivered in 10 days. I closed the notebook and leaned back, windows open to the gentle Wellington night. For the first time in years, I was leading enterprises through transformation on my own terms. And as I switched off my desk lamp, the final thought drifting through my mind was simple and certain. I was not just visible, I was indispensable. I woke before sunrise on my second morning at Pacific Aquaponics, the faint glow of dawn just beginning to silhouette the glass domes against the sky. Today's agenda was to observe day-to-day operations, fine-tune the governance templates we drafted yesterday, and meet with the finance and legal teams to review the proposed bylaws. I dressed in a light grey jumpsuit, a practical combination of professionalism and ease of movement for walking between greenhouses, and slipped my tablet and notebook into a canvas tote. By 7:15, I was in the investor pavilion, where a pot of herbal tea still steamed beside yesterday's coffee mugs. I poured myself a cup, mint and lemon verbena, and reviewed the draft governance charter on my tablet. All sections were labelled in words: governance scope, decision thresholds, escalation protocols, and communication standards. I had highlighted the clause requiring a 75% majority for any capital expenditure exceeding $5,000 New Zealand dollars, and I planned to solicit feedback on that today. Just after 7:30, Miguel arrived, carrying a stack of printed documents. He smiled and set them on the table. Aurora asked me to compile your notes from yesterday and include our legal team's comments, he said. We'll start with your escalation provision and then review the investor portal mock-up. I nodded gratefully and opened my notebook to the page titled Day 2, Governance Refinement. At 8 o'clock, Aurora joined us, followed by Leah Turner, the in-house counsel, and Gabe Sinclair, who handled operational finance. Leah wore a crisp navy suit, and Gabe carried a laptop loaded with spreadsheets. We greeted each other warmly, and I began by walking them through the refined escalation flowchart. 1. Issue identification. Any pod investor or operations lead can flag a critical decision via the investor portal. Dusra. Council review. The pod council has 48 hours to vote on proposals. 3. Executive escalation. If no decision is reached, the proposal escalates to the executive committee, currently Aurora and Gabe, for approval within 24 hours. Nangavde. Emergency overrides. For safety or compliance matters, the committee can authorize expenditures up to $5,000 immediately, with post-implementation reporting. Aindavde. Audit notification. All escalations and overrides are recorded automatically in the audit log and must be included in the next quarterly audit report. As I spoke, Leah interjected with legal context. We should add a provision requiring written notification to all investors within 12 hours of an executive override, she suggested. That ensures transparency and protects your fiduciary duty. I agreed, tapped my tablet, and updated the framework in real time, verbally confirming the change with the team. Next, I projected the investor portal prototype onto the pavilion's large screen. I demonstrated how flagged decisions would populate a dashboard, with colour-coded statuses, pending, approved, escalated and closed, and how investors could subscribe to automated email summaries at weekly or monthly intervals. Gabe pointed out a scenario. What if an investor misses the escalation window entirely? I showed him a fallback mechanism. The system sends a text reminder twice, after 24 and after 36 hours. And if the investor still does not respond, the proposal automatically escalates to the executive committee. Everyone nodded in agreement. After that session, we walked through the facility a second time. I watched technicians monitor water quality sensors and observed how the backup generator hummed quietly in its enclosure. At each station, I asked targeted questions. How do you document temperature deviations? Who is responsible for logging maintenance on the pumps? What reporting cadence do you follow to reconcile vendor invoices? Each answer revealed a nuance to integrate into the governance charter. I made notes in my leather portfolio, ensuring that every operational insight found its way into the final document. By midday, we reconvened for a working lunch on the outdoor patio, a generous spread of mezze platters, fresh bread, and locally pressed apple cider. The informal setting encouraged candid discussion. Leah described upcoming regulatory changes that could affect aquaponics, new water usage standards, and food safety audits. And we discussed how to embed compliance triggers into the escalation protocols. Aurora suggested including a clause for periodic legal reviews every 6 months. I agreed and added it to my notes under Legal Compliance Cycle. The afternoon was reserved for finalising the draft charter. We sat around the harvest table, each of us with a printed copy. I guided the team through each section, reading aloud the definitions and provisions. When we came to the director nomination process, Leah recommended specifying term lengths. 2-year terms, with a maximum of 2 consecutive terms unless a special resolution extends them. We debated briefly and settled on her language, then moved on to quorum requirements. 51% of pod votes, or at least 5 investors present. At around 3:30, we completed our review. Aurora closed her eyes and exhaled deeply. "Rowan, this is more comprehensive than I ever imagined," she said. "You've taken our feedback and created a governance charter that will serve us for years." Gabe grinned, and the investor portal interface matches the document seamlessly. Leah added, "From a legal perspective, it's rock solid." I felt a warm glow of accomplishment as I packed up my materials. Before departing, I handed each participant a branded USB drive engraved with Harbour Light Consulting, containing the digital charter, investor portal templates, and a 15-page implementation guide with timelines. Aurora thanked me with a heartfelt handshake and said, "I can't wait to roll this out. We'll schedule a rollout meeting next week to onboard all investors." I offered my assistance for that session as well, ensuring a smooth transition. On the drive back to Napier Airport, I reflected on the 2 days I'd spent immersed in their operations, observing, advising, and co-creating. I realised that the most fulfilling work came not from drafting documents in isolation, but from collaborating to solve real-world challenges. My phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Just saw your update on Meridian's audit. All clear, no liabilities. Congrats." I smiled and replied, "Thank you. Ready for whatever comes next." The flight to Wellington carried me home beneath a sky streaked with sunset hues. As the city lights unveiled themselves below, I felt grateful for the journey. A trajectory that had taken me from the silent corridors of Carter Estates into the warm glow of Harbour Light Consulting. And though another busy week awaited with Southern Orchards workshop follow-up and remote advisory calls, I felt steady, anchored by the knowledge that each step I took was mine to define. I returned to Wellington just before dusk, the city lights twinkling like a field of fireflies below my taxi window. My head buzzed with the day's lessons, the clarity that came from refining Pacific Aquaponics governance charter, the satisfaction of seeing investors nod in agreement around the harvest table, and the confidence I felt as I handed out those branded USB drives. Yet, even as I replayed those moments in my mind, I knew there was work waiting back at my flat. Updates to my report for Meridian Bank, follow-up with Southern Orchard Ventures, and the email to Aurora outlining next steps for their investor portal rollout. The evening air carried the scent of sea salt and jasmine from nearby gardens, reminding me that home was not just a state of mind, but a physical place I had chosen. By 6:30, I was settled at my writing desk. A fresh pot of peppermint tea steamed beside my laptop, and I opened the file titled Pacific Aquaponics On-Site Assessment, Day 2. I reviewed the document structure, an executive summary, key findings, governance charter draft, investor portal mockups, implementation timeline, and a list of recommended next phase activities. Each section had numbered headings spelled out in words 1, 2, 3, and so on, ensuring consistency with my branding guidelines. I refined the language, adding the changes Leah Turner had suggested. The 12-hour investor notification after executive overrides, the 6-month legal review cycle, and the 2-year term limits for board members. I cross-checked every clause against the corporate bylaws and tested each hyperlink to supporting documents. At 8 o'clock, I paused to send the finalised report to Aurora and her team, along with a calendar invitation for the Investor Portal kickoff meeting on the 1st of next month. I wrote a concise cover email. Dear Aurora, please find attached the completed on-site assessment report, including the refined governance charter, investor portal interface designs, and the implementation guide. I look forward to our portal rollout session on the 1st of next month at 10 o'clock. In the meantime, feel free to reach out with any questions. Warm regards, Rowan Carter, founder and principal consultant, Harbour Light Consulting. I hit send and leaned back in my chair, exhaling deeply. The soft chime of my email client confirmed that the message had departed. I allowed myself a moment to acknowledge the small victory. Clear communication delivered on time, no last-minute corrections, no ambiguous next steps. Next, I turned to Southern Orchard Ventures. I drafted a follow-up email to Mei Chen and Tamsin Rivers, summarizing the 5-step governance framework we had co-created, listing the 2 action items they would address this week, finalizing the emergency escalation provision, and scheduling the first quarterly governance audit and attaching a slide deck with customizable templates. I suggested a virtual check-in call later in the week, proposing Thursday at 3 o'clock. I signed off with my usual blend of warmth and professionalism. With both key clients updated, I reviewed my calendar for the coming days. A virtual meeting with Greenwave Hydroponics on Wednesday morning. Drafting the governance workshop materials for Southern Orchard's next session on Friday. And a 1-hour consultation call with Mei Chen on Thursday. I smiled, realizing that my week would be busy but balanced, each engagement distinct, each requiring my full attention, and each reinforcing the value I brought. Before closing my laptop, I opened a new draft for a LinkedIn article. I titled it, From Invisible Co-Signer to Visible Consultant, Lessons in Governance, Resilience, and Self-Authorship. I wrote the opening paragraphs, weaving an anecdote about that voicemail my mother left 2 years ago, and the moment I realized that silence was not peace. I outlined 3 core lessons. Assert your value early, document everything, and design transparent processes. I paused at the end of the introduction, planning to flesh out examples from Carter Estates, Southern Orchard, and Pacific Aquaponics. The article felt daunting, but I reminded myself that storytelling was part of my brand, sharing insights in a way that resonated with other professionals who might see themselves in my journey. By 10:30, I closed the draft and sighed contentedly. My home office was a picture of ordered calm, a small potted succulent at the edge of my desk, a stack of Liberty Theatre playbills collected over past weekends, and the brass paperweight shaped like an anchor, a symbol of Harbour Light Consulting. I glanced at the framed photograph above my desk, a shot from my Stanford graduation, cap tossed mid-air against a backdrop of red brick. It was a reminder of how far I had come, and of the potential that still lay ahead. I powered down my laptop and poured myself a glass of Pinot Gris. My choice, not dictated by any family cellar inventory. I carried it to the balcony, where the night air felt cool against my skin. I took a slow sip, tasting the crisp notes of apple and pear, and let my gaze drift across the harbour. The water was calm, reflecting the city lights like glittering sequins. In that moment of quiet triumph, I realised something essential. Visibility was not a gift granted by others, but a right I had claimed. Each email sent, each workshop led, each report delivered was an assertion of my expertise and agency. No longer bound by the unspoken expectations of a family business that took me for granted, I was now the architect of my own path. And as I set down my glass and inhaled the Atlantic breeze, I felt ready for whatever the next dawn would bring, anchored by my past, guided by my purpose, and illuminated by my own harbour light. I awoke to the low hum of traffic outside my window, sunlight filtering through the sheer curtains and casting shifting patterns on the hardwood floor. It was Wednesday morning, and my calendar reminded me of a half-hour call with Ethan McAllister, co-founder of Green Wave Hydroponics, to discuss their pilot expansion in the Bay of Plenty region. I stretched, reached for my leather-bound notebook, and flipped to the pages headed Green Wave Intake Call, where I had already sketched 3 key discussion points in written words: current governance gaps, risk mitigation strategies, and long-term exit planning. Over the past 2 days, I had finalised the governance charter for Pacific Aquaponics and updated Southern Orchard's escalation protocols, and now I was eager to replicate that same structured clarity for another innovative venture. By 8 o'clock, I settled into my home office, tapped open the video conference application, and greeted Ethan with a warm smile. He appeared on screen against the backdrop of a sleek indoor greenhouse module. "Good morning, Rowan," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Thanks for making time on such short notice." I nodded and offered a brief thanks for including me in their next growth phase. Ethan introduced Marisol Reyes, their Chief Technical Officer, and Tom Zhang, Head of Investor Relations. Each of them had prepared their own set of notes, and I could sense the hunger for practical solutions. We began with a review of their current governance structure, which Ethan described as a lean model ideal for rapid prototyping, but lacking formal escalation mechanisms. I listened carefully as Marisol detailed recent supply chain bottlenecks, delayed nutrient deliveries, and cracked seeds that had cost them both time and investor confidence. Each anecdote underscored the need for reliable decision-making channels and transparent documentation. I leaned forward, tapping my pen against the desk to emphasize each point as I spoke. "Your model allows for agile responses, which is excellent for innovation," I said. "But without defined thresholds and oversight, small disruptions can cascade into larger financial or reputational risks." I outlined a 4-step augmentation plan. First, implement a tiered approval matrix based on project size. Second, institute a monthly financial reconciliation ritual with assigned leads. Third, develop a risk register that maps potential supply chain failures to response protocols. And fourth, schedule quarterly stakeholder town halls to keep investors and employees aligned. Tom nodded appreciatively. "That risk register sounds promising. How would we structure it?" I opened my shared screen and displayed a template. Columns labelled risk description, likelihood, impact level, primary owner, and mitigation action. For each supply chain node, you assess the likelihood on a scale of low, medium, or high, and the impact likewise. Then assign a primary owner, perhaps your procurement manager, to monitor and trigger mitigation actions, such as sourcing alternative suppliers or increasing buffer stock. This transforms abstract worries into concrete tasks. Marisol chimed in. "This will help us track issues systematically. I can see how it dovetails with our existing project management tools." I smiled, recalling the countless vendor disputes I had quietly resolved under Carter Estate's roof, and how a similar register would have spared me sleepless nights. We spent the next 45 minutes walking through examples: delayed shipping of biologically certified seeds, power outages affecting greenhouse climate controls, and unanticipated fluctuations in fish mortality rates. For each, we drafted sample entries in the register and role-playing conversation snippets to illustrate how the approval matrix and stakeholder town halls would occur in practice. At the end of the call, Ethan and Tom expressed their gratitude. "Rowan, this is exactly the structured approach we needed," Ethan said. "We'll pilot the register this week and set up our first town hall next Friday." I confirmed the follow-up. I would receive their initial risk entries by Friday morning and prepare a concise 1-page summary for stakeholders, As the call ended, I felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. Another team empowered, another governance framework taking shape. Midday found me drafting the one-page summary template for Pacific Aquaponics, incorporating feedback from Aurora's investor portal kickoff. I labeled the document Governance Dashboard, Pacific Aquaponics, and organized sections under key metrics, escalation log, and upcoming reviews. I included placeholders for 5 critical KPIs: water quality incidents, escalation counts, override expenditures, audit compliance status, and policy revision dates, each spelled out in text to maintain consistency with my branding guidelines. By 2 o'clock, the draft was ready for review and sent to Aurora for her input. Later that afternoon, I shifted focus to Southern Orchard Ventures, preparing materials for their next virtual check-in. I refined the slide deck to include interactive polls, asking participants to vote on priority risk areas during the meeting, and embedded screenshots of their updated digital record-keeping system. I rehearsed my talking points aloud, emphasizing how their adoption of structured governance had already yielded tangible improvements, accelerated decision times, reduced budget variances, and stronger investor confidence. When evening arrived, I closed my laptop and decided to step away from screens. I prepared a simple dinner, grilled eggplant with tahini and a side of steamed greens, then settled on the couch with my notebook, flipping to a blank page labelled Reflections Week 2. I wrote 3 paragraphs in flowing script about the evolution of my identity, from silent collaborator of a family empire to independent consultant illuminating pathways for others. I acknowledged the persistent ache of family estrangement, but I also noted the liberation that came with each client's success, each governance milestone achieved. Before bed, I drafted a tweet, brief yet heartfelt. Governance is not red tape. It's a roadmap that guides innovation into sustainable impact. Leadership, Shakti Agritech, Shakti Harbour Light. I scheduled it for the next morning at 8, aligning with my brand's cadence of thoughtful insights shared at the start of each business day. I turned off the lamp, letting the room linger in darkness, punctuated by the distant glow of streetlights. As I closed my eyes, I affirmed to myself, I was more than a name removed from a co-ownership portal. I was a force for clarity, accountability, and growth, visible, valued, and fully realized. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, the sky above Wellington a flawless expanse of pale blue. I sat at my desk by 7 o'clock, savouring a mug of rooibos tea while reviewing my to-do list for the day. My first task was to finalise the one-page stakeholder summary for Green Wave Hydroponics based on the risk register entries Ethan had sent overnight. Next, I would host the virtual town hall for Southern Orchard Ventures at 10:45 a.m, and then commit the afternoon to drafting my LinkedIn article on governance lessons learned from family business dynamics. Each item on the list was spelled out in words, 1 document, 2 meetings, 3 articles, to keep me centred in my branding guidelines. By 8:15 a.m, I had updated the Greenwave summary with 7 identified risks, each rated as low, medium, or high, with corresponding mitigation actions and owners. I emailed the finished file to Ethan and Tom with a brief note. Dear Ethan and Tom, please find attached the governance dashboard template populated with your initial risk entries. Let me know if any adjustments are needed before your first town hall next Friday. Regards, Rowan. Their swift reply, looks perfect, thank you, brought a quiet glow of satisfaction. I closed that project folder and opened my town hall slides for Southern Orchard Ventures. At 10, I logged into the virtual meeting room, greeted by Mei Chen, Tamsin Rivers, and 4 other board members. As they joined, I shared my screen and began with a recap of our 5-step governance framework, emphasizing the emergency escalation protocols and the newly adopted quarterly audit schedule. We moved then into a live poll. Participants rated their confidence in each governance component on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 signalling high confidence. The real-time results lit up the side of the presentation. Most scores clustered at 4, indicating solid endorsement, but also room for fine-tuning. I invited comments. Peter Davies, their logistics lead, mentioned a lingering concern about vendor contract renewals slipping through the cracks. I suggested scheduling an annual vendor review session in their calendar, assigning specific dates and owners in their shared portal. Lana Brooks, a pod investor, asked whether the investor newsletter could include a brief governance tip of the quarter to reinforce best practices. I encouraged her to draft the first tip herself, fostering ownership and buy-in. By 11:45, we had agreed on 3 actionable steps: integrate the vendor review meeting into the board calendar, pilot the governance tip newsletter next month, and circulate revised board minutes within 3 business days of each meeting. After thanking everyone and closing the meeting at noon, I made myself a quick lunch and turned to my draft LinkedIn article. I titled it, "When Family Legacy Fails: How Governance Can Save Your Business," and began weaving in the narrative of my own journey. From the moment I first logged into the co-ownership portal to remove my name, through the laughter-tinged sting of being called an outsider, to the clarity I discovered in collaborating with Pacific Aquaponics and Southern Orchard Ventures, I interspersed 3 key lessons: document everything, set clear decision thresholds, and embrace transparent escalation. As I wrote, I imagined potential readers, entrepreneurs wrestling with unspoken family expectations, or solo founders seeking to formalize processes without sacrificing agility. I described how a well-structured governance framework can become both a shield against mismanagement and a beacon for sustainable growth. By 2:30 p.m., the article was polished and ready. I hit publish and immediately shared it to my network, accompanying it with a concise post. Too often, family businesses bind employees in silence, mistaking quiet compliance for loyalty. In my experience, the real power lies in clear governance, setting roles, thresholds, and escalation paths that keep everyone visible and accountable. Here are 3 lessons I've learned. Leadership, so governance, Light. Within minutes, likes and comments began to accumulate. Former classmates, industry peers, and even complete strangers commended the insights. One comment from a 3rd-generation winery operator read, "This resonates deeply. Thank you for sharing," I replied thoughtfully, inviting further discussion. The final task of my workday was to sketch out a keynote presentation for the local Wellington Business Summit, which I had been invited to speak at next month. The theme was Innovating Through Governance, and the organisers had requested a 20-minute talk, followed by a 10-minute Q&A. I outlined 4 main sections: my personal narrative, the 5-step framework, case studies from clients, and practical takeaways for audience members. I planned to open with a striking anecdote, recounting the terse voicemail from my mother that set me on this path, and close with a call to action, encouraging business leaders to audit their own governance practices within 30 days. By 5 p.m., I leaned back in my chair, satisfied with the day's progress. I dimmed my desk lamp, poured a glass of orange-infused water, and stepped onto my balcony to inhale the evening air. In the distance, I could see the silhouette of the harbour bridge, lights reflecting on the water below. My phone, silent of family calls, buzzed gently with client messages and social media notifications, proof that I was no longer invisible but intentionally engaged on my own terms. As twilight deepened, I closed my notebook, its pages filled with reflections, task lists, and milestones, and whispered a quiet affirmation. I define my own legacy. Then I turned in early, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, each one a chance to shine my harbour light a little brighter. I awoke on the morning of the Wellington Business Summit, feeling a familiar flutter of adrenaline mixed with quiet resolve. After weeks of preparing my keynote, titled Innovating Through Governance, I was ready to stand before a packed auditorium of entrepreneurs, executives, and investors and share the story that had reshaped my own path. I dressed in a tailored forest green sheath dress and a slate grey blazer, chosen to convey both approachability and authority. Every detail had been considered. My speaking notes printed in a clean serif font, my slides polished with the harbour light teal accent, and my laptop pre-connected to the venue's AV system. By 8:30, I was backstage in the summit's grand hall, the scent of fresh coffee and pastries drifting through the air. I ran through my opening lines one last time, the crisp voicemail from my mother, the moment I realised silence was not peace, and the decision to reclaim my name from Carter Estates. I reminded myself that I was not simply recounting a personal journey, but offering a blueprint for sustainable leadership. As I paced the wings, I closed my eyes and took 3 deep breaths, feeling the steady thrum of my heartbeat as a source of energy rather than anxiety. At precisely 9, the MC introduced me. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Rowan Carter, founder and principal consultant of Harbour Light Consulting, here to speak on how clear governance can drive innovation and resilience. Applause rippled through the room as I stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand. The auditorium lights dimmed, and the first slide appeared behind me. A simple statement in white text on a dark background. Silent compliance breeds invisible liabilities. I began. 2 years ago, I received an unadorned voicemail. Don't bother. Coming home? Family ties are severed. 18 words that echoed the culmination of years spent managing a multi-million-dollar family enterprise, quietly, efficiently, and invisibly. That day, I learned that being useful is not the same as being included. Governance taught me that clarity and accountability are not bureaucratic obstacles, but the very scaffolding that allows innovation to flourish. As I clicked to the next slide, the audience leaned forward in their seats, some nodding, others scribbling notes. I walked them through the 5-step framework I had used with Pacific Aquaponics and Southern Orchard Ventures, defining roles and responsibilities, establishing decision thresholds, implementing escalation protocols, documenting and communicating, and reviewing and adapting. For each step, I shared a concise anecdote. The $14,600 duplicate invoice that went unnoticed, the council vote that deadlocked financing for a critical generator, and the automated audit log that restored trust at Pacific Aquaponics. Midway through my talk, I paused and posed a question to the audience. How many of you have been part of a decision that stalled because roles were unclear? Hands shot up, more than half of the room. I invited one executive to share her experience, a frozen budget meeting at a tech startup that nearly cost them a promising partnership. Her story underscored the universal pain of ambiguity. I nodded empathetically. When you know exactly who decides what and how, you unlock agility. Governance is your accelerator, not your brake. I transitioned to a live poll, asking attendees to rate their organization's confidence in each governance component on a scale of 1 to 5. The results projected in real time. Most scores hovered around 3, indicating room to grow. I encouraged them. Treat that 3 as your starting line. Map your governance gaps, assign owners, and commit to a 30-day sprint to implement pilot protocols. As I reached the final section of my presentation, I shared 3 keys to lasting impact. 1. Lead with transparency. Publish meeting minutes and audit summaries to build collective ownership. 2. Practice disciplined escalation. Use threshold triggers as guardrails, not dead ends. Moondram. Embrace iterative review. Schedule annual governance health checks and adapt as your enterprise evolves. To illustrate, I projected a brief video clip of Pacific Aquaponics Investor Portal in action. Color-coded statuses, automated reminders, and integrated audit logs. The audience watched as investors cast votes, managers approved emergency purchases, and legal counsel received instant notifications. The room buzzed with visible fascination. I closed with a personal reflection. Leaving Carter Estates was not an abandonment of loyalty, but an embrace of authenticity. I stepped into my own visibility, and in doing so, I lit the harbour light for others to follow. Governance isn't about controlling people, it's about empowering them to act with clarity and confidence. The final slide read simply, "Make yourself visible. Illuminate your path." I stepped back and the auditorium erupted in applause, an echo of resonance I had never experienced in family boardrooms. After the keynote, a line formed at the stage door. Summit organisers, fellow speakers, and attendees alike shook my hand, offered compliments, and asked for follow-up consultations. One CEO approached me with a business card and said, "Rowan, your framework is exactly what we need as we scale internationally. Let's talk next week." As evening fell and the summit wound down, I reflected on the power of stepping into the light of one's own story. That day, I did more than deliver a presentation. I invited an entire community to rethink how they define leadership. And as I packed away my notes and slides, I knew the harbour light, my own and those of the organisations I guided, would continue to shine well beyond Wellington's harbour horizon. I awoke the morning after the Wellington Business Summit feeling both exhilarated and contemplative. My keynote had concluded to enthusiastic applause, yet the day's success carried with it the weight of new responsibilities. I rose early before the city stirred and brewed a pot of rich French press coffee. I carried my mug to the balcony, where the first fingers of dawn crept across the harbour's shimmering surface. Below, ferries glided silently. Above, seabirds wheeled in pale sky. I savoured the solitude, reflecting on how far I had travelled since the terse voicemail that prompted my departure from Carter Estates. My name, once a mere signature on back-office portals, was now spoken with respect and interest across boardrooms and conference halls. But respect and interest demanded sustenance, actionable strategies, consistent delivery, and unwavering integrity. By 8:30, I was at my writing desk, opening the folder labelled Post-Summit Follow-Ups. I reviewed a stack of business cards. The CEO of an agritech startup in Rotorua who wanted a governance audit, the head of a venture capital firm seeking a workshop on board dynamics, and the director of a sustainability incubator hoping to feature me in an upcoming panel discussion. I transcribed each contact into my digital Rolodex, names spelled in full, titles and affiliations noted precisely, follow-up dates assigned. My practice had become a meticulous choreography. I treated each new lead not as a potential paycheck, but as an opportunity to illuminate governance challenges and guide organisations toward ethical resilience. At 9:15, I drafted concise, personalised emails to each contact. To the agritech CEO, I proposed a 2-day site assessment akin to my work with Pacific Aquaponics, outlining a preliminary scope: 1 day of operational observation, 1 day of governance workshops. To the venture capital head, I suggested a virtual roundtable to explore integrating governance criteria into due diligence processes, drawing on my experience refining investment protocols at Greenwave Hydroponics. To the incubator director, I offered to co-host a panel on the intersection of sustainability and governance, proposing potential guests and topics. Each message maintained the harbour light aesthetic, professional yet warm, precise yet personable, with every number spelled out in words. By 10, I transitioned to client work for Southern Orchard Ventures. Their virtual rollout meeting was scheduled for 11 a.m, providing another chance to facilitate best practices in their new investor portal. I opened the portal dashboard on my screen, colour-coded status bars, automated alerts, and an interactive calendar populated with governance milestones. I reviewed the 3 pilot governance tips they had agreed to circulate: 1 on annual vendor reviews, 1 on emergency escalation transparency, and 1 on quarterly audit summaries. I prepared a brief slide deck highlighting early wins: a 20% reduction in decision-making bottlenecks, a 15% improvement in vendor payment timelines, and unanimous positive feedback from 4 pilot investors. At 10:45, I logged into Southern Orchard's virtual meeting room. Mei Chen, Tamsin Rivers, and 5 additional investors greeted me with eager anticipation. I began by sharing the portal analytics. 24 alerts triggered for escalation protocols in the first week, all resolved within the prescribed 48-hour and 24-hour windows. I highlighted case studies of 2 instances where the emergency override clause had authorized a $4,000 equipment repair, preventing crop spoilage during an unexpected frost. Each example underscored how clear governance structures translate directly into operational resilience and financial stability. We then moved into a collaborative brainstorming session. I asked each participant to propose one improvement based on their portal experience. Peter Davies recommended adding a weekly digest email summarizing all open and closed escalations, a suggestion I agreed to implement immediately. Lana Brooks suggested incorporating a feedback form for each escalation resolution to capture investor satisfaction ratings. Tamsin Rivers proposed an annual governance retreat to review the portal's functionality and strategic updates. I captured each idea, promising to integrate them into the portal's upcoming revision cycle. By noon, the session concluded with a renewed sense of collective ownership. I closed my laptop with a feeling of quiet pride, knowing that the frameworks I introduced were not static artifacts, but living systems, refined through continuous input. My phone buzzed with a message from Aurora Moon. Just reviewed the portal analytics. Team engagement is off the charts. Thank you, Rowan. I replied with genuine gratitude and a commitment to deliver the next portal iteration by month's end. In the early afternoon, I turned to my LinkedIn article's engagement metrics. Overnight, the post, "When Family Legacy Fails, How Governance Can Save Your Business," had garnered over 80 comments, 300 likes, and a reach extending into 4 continents. Readers shared their own governance pain points, stalled board decisions, unclear role definitions, and the silent erosion of family enterprises. I replied to each comment with concise advice and links to relevant resources, fostering an active dialogue. In these exchanges, I found not only validation, but also inspiration for future content. Case studies to compile, questions to address, and best practices to distill into downloadable guides. By 3 p.m., I drafted an outline for a comprehensive ebook. The Harbour Light Handbook, Governance for Sustainable Growth. The proposed chapters included one on governance fundamentals, one on designing escalation protocols, one on digital tools and analytics, one on board dynamics, and one on case studies showcasing transformational success. I envisioned it as a free resource for my network, a tangible manifestation of my commitment to accessible, actionable governance wisdom. As the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my workspace, I closed my notebook and sat back, reflecting on the trajectory of the past months. From the moment I removed my name from Carter Estates 2 years ago, I had embarked on a journey from invisibility to visibility, from silent compliance to empowered consultancy. Each workshop led, each keynote delivered, each governance system implemented had reaffirmed my purpose: to guide organizations toward transparent, resilient leadership. And as I prepared to structure the Harbour Light Handbook, I recognized that my own evolution mirrored the frameworks I championed, defining roles, setting thresholds, escalating wisely, documenting meticulously, and reviewing continuously. I stood and poured myself a fresh cup of rooibos tea, savouring the aroma of peace and possibility. Outside, Wellington's skyline shimmered in the golden light, a testament to the promise of new beginnings. I raised my cup in silent salute to the harbour light within, steady, illuminating, and ever guiding toward horizons of clarity and integrity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new collaborations, and new opportunities to make myself and my clients truly visible. And with that reassuring thought, I returned to my desk, ready to chart the next chapter of my journey. The following morning, I stirred before dawn once more, the familiar hush of my Wellington flat greeting me like an old friend. Today marked the culmination of my Harbour Light Handbook project. I would finalize the manuscript and send it to the designer team, transforming my years of governance frameworks, case studies, and personal reflections into a cohesive guide. As I dressed in comfortable slacks and a soft cashmere sweater, I felt a quiet excitement, the kind that comes from nearing the finish line of something deeply meaningful. By 6:30, I settled at my writing desk with a fresh pot of Earl Grey tea and opened the document titled Harbour Light Handbook Final Draft. The table of contents stood before me in clean serif type. Introduction: From Invisible to Visible. Chapter 1. Defining Roles and Responsibilities. Chapter 2. Establishing Decision Thresholds. Chapter 3. Implementing Escalation Protocols. Chapter 4. Documenting and Communicating. Chapter 5. Reviewing and Adapting. Case Studies. Pacific Aquaponics, Southern Orchard, Green Wave Hydroponics. Key takeaways and practical templates. I scrolled to the first chapter, where I had woven in my anecdote about overseeing seasonal hiring at Carter Estates and the lesson that authority, without inclusion, breeds silent resentment. My goal was to illustrate how clearly defined roles empower every stakeholder, whether that is a third-generation family member or a first-time investor, to contribute confidently. I polished the language, ensuring each numbered list used words 100%, 2 roles, 3 approvals, and so forth, to maintain consistency throughout the text. Next, I advanced to Chapter 2, where I refined the section on decision thresholds. I re-emphasized the importance of specifying majority vote requirements, simple majority, 2/3 or 75%, and linked these to real-world scenarios. I added a sidebar titled Thresholds in Practice, drawing on the Pacific Aquaponics funding impasse that I had resolved through a 48-hour voting mechanism. I described how that protocol not only prevented operational shutdowns, but also built trust among reluctant investors. By 8 o'clock, I reached Chapter 3, Implementing Escalation Protocols. Here, I expanded on the 5-step framework introduced in my speeches and workshops, illustrating each step with numbered bullet points and diagrams. I introduced a new element, a flowchart template labeled Protocol Alpha, showing how an issue flagged by any team member moves through council review, executive escalation, and audit notification. I included a note on customization. Businesses can adjust the spending cap for emergency overrides, 5,000, 10,000, or more, depending on their scale. At 9:15, I paused to take a sip of tea and review the Chapter 4 draft on documenting and communicating. I had already described best practices for record keeping, file naming conventions such as Year 2025 Month May Day 27 meeting minutes, and the value of automated audit logs that track every escalation and override. I supplemented the chapter with a testimonial from Mei Chen of Southern Orchard Ventures, who noted a 20% improvement in stakeholder engagement after adopting these methods. I formatted her quote in italics, adding a brief footnote to acknowledge her permission. By 10:30, I arrived at Chapter 5, Reviewing and Adapting. This final chapter underscored the necessity of scheduling annual governance health checks, appointing an independent reviewer, or rotating committee to assess and refine protocols. I referenced the 6-week follow-up audit at Pacific Aquaponics and the quarterly reviews implemented at Green Wave Hydroponics. I framed these practices as the engine of continuous improvement, ensuring governance frameworks remain aligned with evolving goals and market conditions. At 11, I moved to the case studies section. I crafted 3 concise yet vivid narratives. Pacific Aquaponics: How I established an emergency override clause, built an investor portal, and saw a 15% reduction in operational downtime. Southern Orchard Ventures: How a 48-hour council vote mechanism and a quarterly governance retreat strengthened board cohesion and improved decision times by 25%. Green Wave Hydroponics: How a risk register and stakeholder town halls transformed fragmented communications into coordinated action, fostering a 10% uptick in investor satisfaction. Each story was written in the first person, maintaining the narrative intimacy that guided readers through both triumphs and challenges. I ensured that all numerical data appeared as words, reinforcing my commitment to clarity and stylistic consistency. By 12:30, I reached the key takeaways and practical templates section. Here, I included a set of downloadable templates, a 5-step governance checklist, an escalation flowchart, a sample board charter outline, and a risk register spreadsheet. I wrote a brief introduction for each template, inviting readers to adapt them to their own contexts. I closed the handbook with a short epilogue. Your governance journey. Governance is not a destination, but a journey, one that evolves as your organization grows, diversifies, and adapts. By defining roles, setting thresholds, documenting decisions, and reviewing processes, you illuminate the path forward. Let the Harbour Light Handbook be your guide, and may you always remain visible, accountable, and empowered. At 1 p.m, I saved the final draft, exported it as a high-resolution PDF, and attached it to an email to my design team with the subject, line Harbour Light Handbook Final Manuscript. My message read, "Hello team, please find attached the final manuscript of the Harbour Light Handbook. All chapters are complete and templates are embedded in the final section. Kindly proceed with layout design and let me know if any formatting adjustments are needed. I aim to launch the handbook by the end of this month. Thank you for your support, Rowan Carter." I clicked send, and a wave of accomplishment washed over me. 2 years earlier, I had removed my name from a family enterprise that had taken me for granted. Today, I was sending my name into the world as the author of a comprehensive guide, an embodiment of my expertise and lived experience. By 2 p.m, I took a break to step outside. The Wellington sun was warm on my face as I walked along the waterfront, notebook tucked under my arm. I felt grounded and expansive at once, a woman who had claimed her visibility and, in doing so, had illuminated a path for others. That evening, as I settled in for a quiet dinner of roasted root vegetables and a crisp glass of Sauvignon Blanc, I reflected on the arc of my transformation, from the silence of invisibility to the clarity of governance, from the corridors of family power to the stage of professional autonomy. I had forged a legacy defined by transparency, inclusion, and purpose. And as I raised my glass to the harbour's light shimmering beyond my window, I whispered a final affirmation. I am visible. I am empowered. I am Harbour Light.